Okay, in Romney Marsh, you are in for a treat. This is an absolutely fantastic poem, written by a Scottish poet called John Davidson, who lived from 1857 to 1909. So he is a Victorian, and he's much more likely than most to be a romantic. That's not Valentine's romantic with a small r. That's more a capital R. Somebody who uses nature to help express their own feelings. Okay, what we're looking here is, if you look at this image that's going on here, this is actually a fantastic image to lead into the poem. So what you could probably look at is just kind of look at all the use of colour in the image, and the setting itself is really evocative of what this poem is going to be about. So maybe you could actually have a go at doing that activity there now, and then go on to the rest of the presentation. Okay, Romney Marsh itself, let's find out where it is. There's London. Hopefully you all know where that is. If not, then I think you need to probably go to a Geography GCSE presentation first. Move down here to the southeast. You're going here down into Kent, and here we have in Romney Marsh, which is between Hythe and Dunwich. Okay, so it's a very sparsely populated area. There's hardly anybody that lives there. It's mostly marshland. It's underdeveloped, and it's hardly been touched by man at all. Okay, it has actually many lost villages there. So it was a little bit more populated in the past during the medieval period. So you'll see little Norman churches like this one, which used to be a village called Fairfield, kind of dotting the horizon. So the only people you'll probably see here are people walking their dogs, or the odd mad archaeologist. Okay, but most of it is pretty much entirely wetland. So when John Davison was walking around, though, remember this was in Victorian times, so he wouldn't have had a car. There would have been hardly anything there that was modern. Okay, although this is the period in the Victorian age when these settings are starting to be changed. Just like, for example, these days, if you walk around a country park, it's very likely that you'll be able to see huge pylons that were built in the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, but this poem was published in 1922, but was obviously written before this man's death in 1909. So it's late Victorian, early Edwardian. Okay, here's a few questions that you could actually have a go at doing yourselves to see what you can come up with. Have a look through the whole poem and see how colour is used and how sound is used, and what the kind of feelings that would come out of this, particularly one of a mystical religious nature. Okay, so you've probably realised that this poem is really about a man's journey as he travels through Romney Marsh, and it's also travel through time as well, so time and place, where he is moving through, and he's describing the sight of the sunset setting and turning into night, but also that of the colours and the sounds that he experiences as part of this almost religious hymn. It's almost a hymn that he's producing here to the nature and to the countryside, and explaining his own feelings, which is classic romanticism, classic Victorian literature. Okay, and you'll see a lot of things like that, particularly with Composed on Westminster Bridge by Wordsworth. Okay, so let's start off. As I went down to dim church wall, which is also the start of his journey, he's descending. Remember, later on he's ascending in his journey, which is something which is kind of allusions to Jesus' ascension, and that of a sense of a spiritual renewal. Okay, I heard the south sing o'er the land. I saw the yellow sunlight fall. Okay, sound of the south coast. He's actually hearing the south coast. The wind which is running through the south. He's actually using personification here to make it sound almost as if it was the singing of a choir at church. And that's a trope, a motif that's going to be repeated throughout the poem. I saw the yellow sunlight fall. He's starting his journey right in the middle of daylight. Strong, powerful daylight surrounds him. The light. On knolls where Norman churches stand. So on knolls, little hills on which Norman churches stand. If you remember your history from Key Stage 3, the Normans were the first came in after 1066. So this is talking about something that's, for him, 900 years old, for us, closer to 1,000 years old. Ancient religious connotations that stretch back centuries. The Normans built most of their churches, and particularly those smaller ones, in the 11th and 12th centuries. Okay, now we're moving through to the second stanza, and ringing shrilly, taut and live, within the wind a core of sound. So the sound itself is, again, it's the wind, but it's inside the wind. It's the ringing, like church bells. So it's that wind which is kind of linked to the other things that we were talking about to do with religion and religious experience. Within the wind. You can hear it through the alliteration of W. It's actually creating an onomatopoeia, which is the sound of the wind itself. The wire from Romney town to Hythe, along its airy journey wound. The wire, this is the only real piece of context that you can actually include apart from the stuff about Norman churches. The wire is this change. It's the telegraph wire. You know what I was telling you earlier on about pylons and things changing the landscape? Well, the telegraph wire is the big thing that does that. If you look outside your window, or you're on a train journey or a bus journey out in the countryside at any time, it's not many places that you can go without seeing telegraph wires, which are bringing that new communication, bringing people together. In this case, it's bringing the people of Hythe and Romney together. But it's going through this particularly docile and calm place, which is usually untouched by anything modern and technological. This Davidson, I believe, sees this as a threat to the natural beauty of Romney Marsh, because shrill, it's ringing shrilly. That's a particularly harsh adverb to use. And then we have that last bit. I love this. Along its airy journey wound. This use of assonance, which is the repetition of particular vowel sounds, and these ones are all associated with A in general. Along its airy journey wound. It actually almost sounds like the wind itself. So he loves using this imagery, visual imagery with the daylight, sound imagery for the sound of the wind and the sea, as we're going to see later. Visual imagery continues with, a veil of purple vapour flowed and trailed its fringe along the straits. Strong sunset imagery now. We've moved past from yellow, we've gone into purple. So this purple colour is something that's associated with royalty, it's something that's associated with majesty. So maybe this is almost partly it's part of a religious experience too. He's actually becoming closer to God through this experience of seeing everything. And the purple itself could also be seen as part of a kind of a mystical experience that he's having as well. The upper air like sapphire glowed. Sapphire is kind of between purple and bright red, so it's kind of, and that's something that is also something that's particularly precious. Veil is something that we would think about, something to do with, you can think about weddings, brides and nuns. It's something that is kind of drawn across it. So he's actually learning knowledge as well as something that's associated with Christianity and religion. The upper air like sapphire glowed. So that's the upper air of the red sunset. Sapphire is something that's particularly precious. So that simile is particularly important, like sapphire, because that's something we're going to see later on, that he sees this area as something precious that needs to be protected from advancing industrialization. And roses filled heaven's central gates. Again, roses are used in celebration. Okay, and heaven's central gates itself is something that we would describe in particular with talking about how precious this is and how important it is. He's actually describing Romney Marsh, a place that is not that important or that interesting, as something that should be said in the same breath as that of heaven. And then, of course, we move on to the next stanza. Masts in the offing wag to their tops. It's almost as if they're part of this choir, the masts of the boats that are just off into the horizon. He's starting to describe the sea beyond, because his journey means that he's moving towards the coast and he's able to see things more clearly. The swinging waves peeled on the shore. I think that makes us think of bells, doesn't it? So now the waves' movement and the sight and the sound of them reminds him of bells, church bells in celebration of this particular place. The saffron beach, again, that suggests a kind of a dark red colour because it is getting darker. But saffron is also something that's particularly highly valued and beautiful. Actually, saffron is worth more than its weight in gold. It's so precious. It's very light, but it's something that's particularly precious and used in cooking. All diamond drops and beads of surge. This is talking about what you can see with the last bit of sunlight glistening on the surface of the water's edge, as you can see it surging, moving in. Prolonged the roar. Surge and roar, it actually makes it sound animalistic, primal, tribal. Remember how we talked back to the Normans, going back 1,000 years? This is something that goes back even further to the primitive origins of man. That's something that is a particularly interesting thing to notice, that this place is savage, it's raw, it's primal, but it's also precious, it's valuable, and it is something that is religiously significant to him. It's something that helps him. Moving on to the next stanza. As I came up from dim church wall, this is where he's got his spiritual renewal now. I saw above the downs low crest. The downs are a group of hills, so he can actually see now back where he came. The crimson brands of sunset fall, and now we're going into a dark red. Crimson is something that you'd usually associate with blood. It's something that is inside him. Life is even more precious as we move on than sapphire, saffron and diamonds. And then we have all these F's moving along. Fall, flicker and fade from out the west. The alliteration F itself is actually quite soothing. Sunset, fall, flicker and fade from out the west. And the sun sets in the west, and I kind of made an allusion here that this is also something to do with the fact that the West is the home of Christianity, which I have spelt terribly there on that PowerPoint, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. And then the last stanza here, night sank, like flakes of silver fire, the stars in one great shower came down. Like flakes of silver fire, again silver is something that's precious and valuable associated with this landscape. And the stars themselves are like the sun's reflection on the waves earlier, so there's that mirroring of that imagery that we saw earlier with the diamonds. The stars in one great shower came down. That's associated with the water of the waves as well. Shrill blew the wind and shrill the wire, but then there's this threat, this repeated threat of the wind, that's true, which can destroy everything in that landscape with a big storm, and the shrill of the wire, which is ringing out. You can hear the wire as it whistles against the telegraph line, which has been put up recently between Hythe and Romney Town. And then I think this is the absolute last stanza. The darkly shining salt sea drops. Darkly shining is itself an oxymoron. Salt sea drops streamed as the waves clashed on the shore. The beach with all its organs stops. Now, what does that sound like to you? To me, that sounds like the waves crashing on the shore themselves. It's onomatopoeic itself. And then moving on to organ is also associated with churches and sound. Pealing again, repetition, prolong the roar. Again, this is like church bells. It's like a church. It's almost like a hymn to nature. Okay. Here are some questions that you could probably think of by yourselves. There's a particularly regular rhyme scheme. This is a calm, sedate. It's a natural poem. It's one in touch with nature. It makes sense that it's a regular rhyme scheme and not in a free verse. It's also in the ballad form, which is also associated with romantic celebratory writing. Okay, and then we also have let's have a quick look. It's also in the first person narration, because this is something that is incredibly deep and meaningful experience for this person who has travelled across Romney Marsh, had a deeply spiritual experience because of how in touch with nature he is, and he is worried and concerned that this nature is going to be threatened and destroyed by advancing industrialization and the ignorance of man Thank you.